Alright, so to find missing sides and angles using trig ratios, we first need to identify what the three trig ratios are, and we're going to use them the whole time, so it's always best to just write them at the top of your paper. So we have the sine of theta. Remember, theta just represents the angle measure. So if we have an angle measure, we're going to put it here, and if we don't know the angle measure, we can use a variable here. And the sine equals the opposite length over the hypotenuse length, and the cosine equals the cosine of an angle equals the adjacent over the hypotenuse, and then the tangent of an angle equals opposite over adjacent. So those are our three trig ratios. We're going to use them the entire time, so make sure you have them down, because that is exactly how we're going to structure our equations that we're going to set up. Notice it's always the trig ratio first, the angle measure, then the fraction, equal to the fraction. The trig ratio, the angle measure, equal to the fraction. So this is the setup no matter which trig function we use. Now, when we're solving, we have to determine which trig function to use based off of the information we're given on the right triangle. So just as we've done before, the first thing you want to do is label the right triangle. So always start with your right angle, and remember the corner of the right angle right here, it's pointing to your hypotenuse. So I'm going to label that with an H. Always use the angle of focus, which is the angle that's there, that's marked here. Why not use that one? It's already marked, has something in it. So we're just going to identify it and then draw the arrow across to the opposite side. So remember, that's our O, opposite side. And then remember, that leaves the third side to be the adjacent side, which is the side that's next to the angle that's not the hypotenuse. So that's our adjacent. So always label just like we have so far. Hypotenuse always across from the right angle. Label or mark the angle of focus. Then the opposite is always across from it. And then adjacent is kind of like that third leftover one. So let that be your order. Now, here's the part where you're going to determine which of the three trig functions to use. You're going to circle the sides that you actually have something on. So we have an X on this side, and we have a 12 on this side. Those are the two sides we actually have something on. This third side we have nothing on. So technically, if you want to, you could just scratch out the H or cross it off or something. That way that H isn't sticking out and making it look like you're going to use it. We're not going to use that H since there's nothing on that side. Nothing on that side. That's how you determine which trig function to use, because we have something on the O side, we have something on the A side. The only of these three trig functions that have O and an H in it, or O and an A in it, is tan. This is the only trig function that has the O and an A being used. So that is how we determine which one to use, because we need to use the one that has the O and the A in it. That's tan. So now we're just going to set it up. So we're going to set it up exactly how this is structured. The tangent of the angle equal to the opposite length over the adjacent length. So the tangent of the angle, well, we have something in our angle, so we're going to put 25 instead of the theta. We're going to put 25 right here because we do know the angle measure, is equal to notice the opposite is on top. Some students say, well, how do you know which one to put on top? Well, it's in the structure of the trig function, so do not switch it up. Leave it exactly how it is here. So we're going to put the opposite length on top, which notice on our O side is an X. So we're going to go ahead and put X on top, and then on our adjacent side, our A is 12. So we're going to put 12 on the bottom. So now what we're going to do is we're going to set up to cross multiply. So remember, to cross multiply, you basically want two fractions. So we want to make this side a fraction by putting a 1 under it. You can always make something a fraction by putting 1 under it. So now we're going to cross multiply. So when we are solving for a missing side we are going to either have a 1 or 2-step equation. So for those of you who like patterns, whenever we have an X on top, this is going to turn into a 1-step equation. Whenever X is on the bottom, which you'll see later on with number 2, you're going to actually have 2 steps. But if you like patterns, that's just something you'll always know. Okay, I know this is going to be a 1-step equation. If you don't really care to pay attention to patterns, it doesn't matter. As long as we do the steps right, we're going to get the correct answer. So 1 times x, remember it's just x because 1 times anything is itself. Now when you multiply this way, it's always best, let me put my equal sign here, it's always best to put whatever is the smallest of the two things that you're multiplying together, put that smaller thing in front. Because what you want it to look like is you want it to look like 12, I should probably be drawing, 12 times the tangent of 25. You do not want it to look like tangent of 25 times 12, because that looks like you're just multiplying the 25 times 12, which you're not. That is terrible. Do not do that. And that is why you want to put the 12 in front. So as I mentioned, when you cross multiply this way, put the smaller thing in front, because remember, tangent of 25 is not the same thing as just 25. That is a decimal sitting right there. We just don't want to turn it into a decimal right away, because then we'll be rounding too soon. We only want to round at the end. So now, if you notice, x is by itself. Since x is by itself on one side of the equal sign, you can go ahead and just put this in the calculator and see what you get. Now, do remember that your calculator needs to be on degree mode. Remember, if you're using like an iPhone calculator or something like that, like a regular basic one that comes on the iPhone, you're going to need to download an app, because you're not going to be able to do the trig inverse functions. But you can ask me about which calculators to use in class, as far as if you need to download an app, if you're virtual. Otherwise, if you have a handheld or something to go already, if you just type in 12 times the tan of 25, as long as you're in degree mode, you should get 5.5956. So I'm going to round to the nearest tenth, about 5.6. I'm going to make my equal sign approximately instead of an equal sign, since we rounded. So x is approximately 5.6. So that's how you do it to solve for missing side. And notice once again that we labeled the triangle with A, H, O, and A. We circled the sides that had something on it. The 12 and the x had something on it, so we circled those. We used the trig function that dealt with O and A, which the only one up there is tangent. We substituted everything in and then cross-multiplied. When we cross-multiplied, x was already by itself, so we were able to just put this in the calculator and we had our answer. So that's how we did it. So what you'll see with this next one, with number 2, just go ahead and start doing that one. I'm going to go ahead and label my triangle. So here's my right angle. That's my side across from the right angle, so that's my hypotenuse. And remember to mark your angle of focus. That's our angle of focus there. I'm going to draw an arrow across. Notice I'm starting kind of in the middle of this arc here, because you want to draw across to the opposite side. That's our opposite. And then our A is our adjacent. So that's always the third one I mark, just because, you know, it's kind of like the leftover one. It's going to be my adjacent every time. So remember, I'm going to then circle whatever I have something on the side, wherever I have something on the side. So I have x on the side, so I circled the hypotenuse. And I also have 12 on this side, so I'm going to circle the adjacent. So notice there is nothing on the O side this time, so I care less about it. I can scratch it out if I want to. That way, really, H and A stands out for me. I'm only dealing with whichever one deals with H and A. So if you look up here, the only one that deals with H and A is cosine. So I'm going to set it up using cosine. I'm going to do cosine. And just as we see here, cosine of the angle measure comes next. So our angle measure in this case is 31. Then comes the equal sign. We're setting up exactly how it looks in the structure up there. And then our fraction, notice the fraction is the A on top, so our adjacent has 12. And then it's the hypotenuse on the bottom, which is x in this case. So notice in this one, it's a little bit different from number 1 since the x is in the denominator. So I'm just letting you know in advance, it's going to turn into a 2-step equation whenever your x is in the denominator. And that's for anyone who likes patterns, so likes to know, okay, well, I know this what I'm going to have to do for this one, you know. But if you're someone who just you don't have to worry about the patterns. You could just go ahead and do it, and you'll see what happens. So we have 12 times 1, which is 12, equals 2. So like I mentioned before, when we cross this other way, we're going to put the smaller thing in the front. So when we cross, we're going to do x times cosine of 31. Notice here, the x is not by itself on one side of the equal sign. The x is actually over here now with cosine of 31. That's why this is a two-step equation, because when we cross multiply, we still have another step to do. We gotta have to get rid of cosine of 31. And number one, x was already by itself, so we were able to just put all that in the calculator. But here, we have to undo multiplying by cosine of 31. Well, remember, to undo multiplication, you just divide. So we're going to divide by cosine of 31, which that is gone. And we have to divide by cosine of 31 on this side. So really we have x is equal to whatever we get when we put in the calculator 12 divided by cosine of 31, which is, so it's like 13.9996. So we're just going to round to 14. So I'm going to make the approximately symbol instead of the equal sign so that we know we rounded. So x is approximately 14. Now remember, make sure your answer makes sense. Obviously, our x in this case represented the hypotenuse. So it makes sense for this to be 14 because it has to be longer than the other two sides. And we know at least it's longer than this one. So that makes sense because 14 is greater than 12. Now, if we ended up with an answer like 9, we should know something went wrong because this hypotenuse has to be the longest side in a right triangle. All right, so hopefully you tried 3 and 4. What I'll do is if you hit pause, try those two, and then I'll put up what I call the naked answers, basically the answers without the work, so you can see if you did it correctly. And then I'll move on to the other type, which is finding an angle. So hit pause, try 3 and 4. So if you tried number 3, if you already hit pause and you tried number 3, hopefully you got that x, that is definitely not writing, so x is approximately 33.3. So if you did that correctly, that's what you should have got. And then for number 4, that x is approximately 7.6. So if you did 3 and 4 right, that's what you should have gotten. If you did not do it correctly, look back, make sure you labeled correctly, make sure you use the right trig function, make sure you cross multiplied, whether or not you had 1 step or 2 steps to do when you cross multiplied. All right, so the other type of problem you can have is where the x is inside. That means it's representing an angle rather than the side length. So we're going to do the same steps, but once we get to the actual solving part, instead of cross multiplying, we're going to do something else. So let me get to that point. So first, same thing as before, we find our right angle, we label our hypotenuse, then we mark our angle of focus, which is x. It's okay if it's not a number, it could be a variable, because that's what we're going to end up finding here is this angle measure. We're going to draw across from it. That is our opposite side. And then remember, the leftover one is your adjacent. It's the one that's next to the angle, that's not the hypotenuse. So now I'm going to do the same thing I did before. I'm going to circle whatever sides I have something on. So notice I have something on the adjacent and the opposite. I don't have anything on the hypotenuse, so I'm just going to scratch it out so that H does not stand out to me. And now I'm going to go back to see which trig function deals with A and O. So going back here, looking at the top, the trig function that deals with A and O is tangent. So I'm going to use tangent of theta, or tangent of the angle measure, equals opposite over adjacent. So I'm going to come write that over here. We have that the tangent of the angle measure, well, in this case our angle measure is x. So tangent of x equals opposite, because O is on top, and tangent over adjacent, which is 20. So here's the deal. You can't just cross multiply to get rid of the tan. The only thing next to x is tan. So to get rid of tan, you have to do what's called inverse tan. So anytime you're finding an angle, you are going to use inverse trig functions. So what that means is you're going to do the inverse tangent of the fraction that we wrote in your calculator, and it's going to tell you what our x equals. And remember, x is an angle measure. So if we put that in our calculator, now, depending on the calculator, you got to figure out where your tan inverse is. If you're on a 36X Pro, you just double tap the tan button. If you're on one of the calculator apps that I told you to download in class, then you're going to have to do second and then hit tangent, and you'll see tangent inverse come up. That's if you're on a phone and not using a handheld, obviously. But you will get approximately 56.3 degrees if you did it correctly. So, once again, and I'm going to put a star here. Whenever you find an angle measure, use inverse trig. So I'm just going to say use inverse trig, and I kind of write inverse trig like that just to remind us what it looks like in the calculator when finding an angle. Alright, so that is very important that we remember, because we don't cross multiply here. We do not cross multiply, because the only way, once again, to get rid of a trig function is to use the inverse trig function. That gets rid of the tangent. And so now we know that x is approximately 56.3 degrees. And remember, technically, if I know this angle measure, I can now find this one, because all three angles should add up to 180 degrees in a triangle. Alright, so I'm going to do another one, number 6. Just so you can kind of see the gist again. You can hit pause if you want to try it yourself. That way you can see if you can successfully do it correctly. And now I'm going to just do it. So if you hit pause, I'm now going to go ahead and go through the steps. So first, of course, we find where our hypotenuse is. So that's our hypotenuse. Then we mark our angle of focus. Draw an arrow across to our opposite side. Then remember the other side, the third side, is then our adjacent. I circle the sides that I have something on. So I have something on the hypotenuse, and I have something on the opposite. I like scratching that out so it's not even in my face. And now I'm looking for which trig function deals with hypotenuse and opposite. So if I go back, hypotenuse and opposite is my sine function, my sine ratio. So sine of our angle measure, should be drawing sine of our angle measure, where our angle measure is x in this case, is opposite, O is on top in that fraction, over hypotenuse, which is 26. So once again, you need to notice that you are finding an angle, and whenever you're finding an angle, you are using inverse trig. So we're going to use inverse sine of that fraction, and that'll give us the angle measure. So we have that x is approximately, if you did it correctly, 32.5789, so I'm going to round to the nearest tenth, first decimal place, so 32.6 degrees is that angle measure there, where the x is. So if you did it correctly, you should have got 32.6. So if you are someone who is not getting these answers, and you are finding your inverse trig button and you know where your trig buttons are, look in your calculator for the mode, try to find the mode, and make sure it's in degrees. If it's in something called radians, that is going to give you different answers. You do not want to ever be in radians in geometry. So you want to change your mode, make sure your mode is on degree. Once again, if you are on a regular app calculator that comes on the phone default, like an iPhone calculator, you are not going to have the inverse trig functions. So I will write down at the bottom here, if you are using an iPhone, I highly recommend the app Graph, I know they spell with an F, in Calc 83. Alright, and make sure you download the right one. There's a lot of phony ones out there. The icon should look kind of like the crosshairs, and then it should have this flower looking thing, and then this yellow flower looking thing inside of that, and then it's a little green little twirly thing come out of it like that. I don't know, something like that. If you are on an Android device, you're going to actually have access to my most recommended calculator for a phone, which is the actual exact calculator is the 83 graphing calculator, or 84. So the app for an Android device that I recommend is Wabbit, EMU. So that is the exact graphing calculator that you see people walking around with that costs $140 handheld, but free in the App Store or the Play Store for Android devices. So those are the two I recommend if you are having to use a app off your phone. Desmos is another one that you could use. It just doesn't look like an actual handheld when you use it, but it does everything. You just got to learn how to use it. So the other option is Desmos, and that's on any device. But you'll have to learn how to use that because it doesn't necessarily look like a handheld, but it does have a lot of cool functions. But once again, I recommend these two because they will be the closest to the two that you have to use for Algebra 2. You have to use in a statistics course, and you absolutely have to have as a requirement in a college level math class. Will be that graphing calculator. All right, hopefully you got enough info to finish this paper, and ask me questions as you have them in class.